Welcome to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. Like any good marriage, we will debate, evaluate, and sometimes quarrel about how privacy and security impact business in the 21st century.
Hi, Jody Daniels here. I'm the founder and CEO of Clover Advisors, a certified women's privacy consultancy. I'm a privacy consultant and certified informational privacy professional, providing practical privacy advice to overwhelmed companies.
Hello, I'm Justin Daniels. I am a shareholder and corporate M&A and tech transaction lawyer at the law firm Baker Donaldson, advising companies in the deployment and scaling of technology. Since data is critical to every transaction, I help clients make informed business decisions while managing data privacy and cybersecurity risk, and when needed, I lead the Legal Cyber Data Breach Response Brigade.
And this episode is brought to you by... Ding, ding, ding. No one can hear when you tap on my head.
But if you say ding, 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 they understand what I'm doing.
Back to our regularly scheduled program. This episode is brought to you by Clover Advisors. We help companies to comply with data privacy laws and establish customer trust so that they grow and nurture integrity. We work with companies in a variety of fields, including technology, e-commerce, professional services, and digital media. In short, we use data privacy to transform the way companies do business. Together, we're creating a future where there's greater trust between companies and consumers. To learn more and to check out our best-selling book, Data Reimagined, Building Trust One Bite at a Time, visit redcloveradvisors.com. Well, hello.
How are you doing today?
Happy first full week of no school in Atlanta.
It's been interesting.
It has been interesting. Now, when you listen to this, it will be well deep, probably into the summer. But while we're recording, we're having so much interesting fun.
Or we're just looking to get to the weekend. Right?
Yes. Okay. Back to what we're actually here to do.
Yeah, we're calling an audible today. We're going in a very interesting direction. So today's guest is Craig Schwartz. He is the head of legal at Covariant, an AI and robotics company out of Berkeley, building foundational models for the physical world. He is a veteran tech lawyer with 20 years of experience at the intersection of emerging technology and regulated markets. Craig was previously at Palantir, where he led the USG Partnerships team and served as counsel for the intelligence community business. Craig, welcome.
Jody and Justin, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
Well, we always get started, and Justin shared a little bit of your background, but can you take us a little bit deeper and help us understand your career journey?
Yeah, sure. So I went to Haverford College up in Philadelphia. Before law school, I worked as a business analyst for Edison Properties, which is a real estate developer up in New York. And what is a business analyst? I feel like that's just like a term that can mean a lot of different things. For me, it was basically the early days of modern data analysis and helping them to build out a program. So kind of in this like kind of 2004 to 2008 timeline, built queries using an AS400, which is today pretty antiquated IBM system, created makeshift dashboards in Excel after cleaning the data in Access, and doing a lot of just like weird daisy chaining of Excel, because like back then it had this like very, very limited number of rows you could pull in any one workbook. But ultimately trying to build tools for the business to be able to like understand what the data they had was telling them, make decisions, and then execute upon those decisions using the data. Another piece of that job, though, involved working with the government relations team of the real estate developer, and that's where I got the legal bug, and I went to law school. Went to law school at Northwestern out in Chicago. I clerked at the Court of Federal Claims in DC, which is the main court for if somebody is suing the government for something other than tort. In practice, it's primarily government contracts disputes, which is what brought me down the path that kind of consumed most of my career up until about a year ago. I also clerked on the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit for the chief judge, and that's the circuit that covers Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. I came back and I worked as a national security lawyer at law firms for about 8 years total. I did some antitrust in my early days just because like I came up through the corporate regulatory group, and at the time they had government contracts and antitrust in the same group. But did a mix of government contracts issues, export sanctions, and payment compliance. cybersecurity, both readiness and response, deal work. So it'd be a mix of CFIUS on the national security side and HSR stuff on the antitrust side. And then, different investigations, crisis management relating to national security or antitrust. In 2019, I started talking with Palantir. They had just recently won a lawsuit against the federal government involving something called the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. Out of scope for this podcast, but it's a kind of interesting law that says the government can't do R&D contracts for something that already exists. There's obviously a lot of nuance to then like whether a commercial product being offered actually is the same as what the government says it needs for a particular requirement. But when Palantir won, and I think to this day, that's the kind of standing precedent on how to interpret FASA, they realized they needed to build out a robust government contracts function. I came in to help them build out government contracts, USG Partnerships, and then more broadly, a national security compliance program. I was there for about 5 years, kind of started in that more government contracts focused role. And then over time, when Palantir went public, I worked on the public listing and became more of a corporate generalist. And that's where Covariant entered the picture. And Covariant's a really cool company. Happy to speak a bit about it. We grew out of OpenAI. OpenAI today is a pretty prominent company, but when it first started, it was broader than the LLMs that I think it's known for today. At some point, they decided to focus on LLMs and formed an alliance with Microsoft that I think is fairly well understood in the media. At that point, some of the original people who were working on some of the interesting non-LLM work left, and many of them formed the backbone of what today is Covariant. And we're focused on building foundation models specifically relating to understanding the physical world. So, one particular use case would be like picking and placing at a warehouse. Like you put an item in front of a robot, being able to understand what that item is, like what unique telemetry aspects it has that would impact how you would pick it up. So is it like at a particular angle? Is there a particular density with which you either want to grip it to make sure you can actually hold it or not want to grip it so you don't damage it? When you put it down on a conveyor belt that's moving, like what are the predictive physics of how it's going to act? Interesting things like that. And, as I learned about the company, I realized like this is a really interesting use case of AI that you're not necessarily hearing about every day. And I got really excited because I think there's all sorts of interesting ways that you could kind of interpose this throughout the supply chain and get all sorts of efficiencies that weren't possible before.
I had the great opportunity to visit the Kia manufacturing plant that's not too far from where we live. And my biggest question was to myself, how do the robots know how to do their job and how to pick up this piece? I was fascinated by all the robots. So I'm really excited. Your example just made perfect sense. And what I had in my head was looking at the entire manufacturing line. And that was all. I'm still fascinated by how does it know how to pick all the different parts? And then how do you know how to even build the robot and how to do all that? But I know we're not going to get into that level of depth, but I find it fascinating.
Well, we're going to come back to that in a minute.
I know.
But for the moment, Craig, something that you and I talked about in our prep for the show was talk to us a little bit about what are the unique challenges of being an early stage U.S. company that it faces when it actually enters the European market early.
No, thanks, Justin. So yeah, just a table set, throughout the world, there's right now an aging demographic. That's particularly the case in Europe and in the West generally, but even more so in Europe vis-a-vis in America. And the result of that is that there's just simply less able-bodied people who are able to work in a physical manual labor environment like a warehouse where there's repetitious tasks that involve physical strength. So there's a strong appetite for automation to be able to fill that gap. In Europe in particular, there also aren't the levels of immigration you have in the US, which often is a steady supply of that type of labor. And so, we're really excited about the European market. There's also just like interesting efficiencies to the way their warehouse and other logistic structures are configured. Because it's a bit more of an urban environment, they're more likely to have efficient layouts, whereas in the US, like we have the luxury of a lot of space. So you might have a sprawling warehouse complex somewhere that at least like up until a few years ago, it didn't matter that it wasn't particularly optimal for automation. In the case of Europe, like they've built more efficiently, really at least over the last like 40, 50 years, which has been an advantage now in kind of adding AI automation to their facilities. But anyway, like assuming you are going to operate in Europe, and I think anyone in the AI or robotics space is going to look at Europe as a major market, you need to think about like unique aspects of that market, one of which is the fact that they have GDPR and other data regulations. They have a piece of legislation also called the Data Act. Sometimes that's referred to in the US as the Internet of Things regulation. It's important to think through both how do you comply with that, and also like from day one, how do you structure your operations such that you even can comply with that? Because there's like specific architectural choices you'd probably make if you're taking GDPR or the Data Act into account from day one. So, and I'm happy to get into some of the details of that, but those are things we think about and have to work within every day.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about you're collecting a lot of data in these activities, and many of the laws talk about data minimization. We want to be able to collect the least amount possible. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the issues that you have when you're thinking about collecting data with AI-infused robotics?
Sure. So let's say you are putting safety cameras on a robot, and generally speaking, you would, right? They're pieces of heavy industrial equipment. Those safety cameras are there primarily to be able to record a scene so that you can optimize aspects of the robot's behavior for safety. They're also there to act as sensors so that if somebody ignores warnings to get too close to a robot while it's operating, it can auto stop, for example. However, like it may be that, because there's a safety camera on a robot, it's going to capture, in passing part of a worker's face as that worker walks by the robot. As a company, you need to think through, well, okay, like one, like how much of that scene do we need to capture? How long do we need to preserve that information for? And I think you need to be prepared for European customers that might take a particularly conservative reading of GDPR and say, well, you need to be able to identify who that worker is so that you could hypothetically operationalize a right to be forgotten of that worker. The reality is under GDPR, I think it's Article 11, you actually don't need to go out of your way to create a database of information relating to personal information that you wouldn't otherwise have to capture but for GDPR compliance. So like, for example, you might get customer pushback saying, well, you need to be able to match a face to a name in order to kind of properly process that data. And like the reality is no, because that would actually be creating a biometric database. And in many ways would actually be worse for privacy than if you were to simply allow that data to exist in the ether. And so, there's a lot of like interesting nuance like that in actual application of GDPR that I will say the regulation has very thoughtfully kind of put into place so that like there are ways to deal with some of these corner cases. But the counterparties you're interacting with aren't necessarily going to be that versed in the regulation themselves and are going to be fairly risk adverse just due to the size of the penalties that can be associated with GDPR non-compliance. So I think if you're a startup, you really need to make it your business, especially as a US company, to understand the intricacies of the regulation so that you can push back where appropriate on like overly conservative interpretations of it that would screw up the entire business case for operating in the environment.
It makes a lot of sense of what you just said and how you've taken your unique business and had to really think through at a very granular level your business processes to make the decisions. This is in scope, this is out of scope. And I like how you articulated that. Many times companies, I think about it at a really high level and forget sometimes to go at the really deep level.
So it's interesting that you've brought up some of these really interesting. Basically, you're there with the product team because to even come up with the architecture, you're there at the beginning because of the EU law. And it brings up my thought of what are some of the unique privacy and security challenges that you have as a global supply chain that gets placed on your company, or really, it sounds to me like you're already making this investment now so that when you go to other markets, you've really thought through these issues because the EU is the most robust privacy law that we have in the world.
No, for sure. So like one we're thinking about a lot right now, at least like, or I would say more generally, any like I think company operating in the industrial AI space should be thinking about is the AI Act and how are we going to comply with that. And the good news is that like unless you're critical infrastructure or you're dealing with consumers, which we can talk about, but that changes the calculus. The reality is that like the AI Act is for the most part not going to be what you need to worry about. You're going to need to be able to make contemporaneous determination at the front end that you're dealing B2B and that you're not critical infrastructure. But beyond that, like the AI Act probably isn't going to be imposing much on your behavior that you're not otherwise doing due to other European regulation. However, there is this Internet of Things regulation that I previously mentioned. And one important thing that I know we thought about is, well, you need to be able to export usage data. I think in 2027, it's not, the law is currently in place, but you don't actually have to meet the export requirements for another couple of years. But I think any American company operating in Europe now should be thinking today, like, am I structuring my product in a way that if I got a request in 2 years to export usage data from the customer, that there would be a way to do that, because that is something that's going to probably be unavoidable.
So I'm a little curious, Craig, given the background of your career, and then you got into this company where you've really had to learn about the IoT Act, GDPR. I'm just curious from your personal journey, how did you go about doing that? Was that a combination of you working with outside counsel, you reading a lot? How did you go about familiarizing yourself with these different laws and then taking it to the next step of being able to operationalize it as part of the development team to help create these architectures that considered these laws from the development phase on?
So I think there's no substitution for, especially for somebody who's perhaps coming from a law firm and going in-house, to just like really digging in and learning the product. And I learned that at Palantir pretty quickly when I joined. There I was doing the national security compliance. So one of the things I had to make sense of was like all the export rules. And the reality is a lot of the rules for exports were written to specifically deal with like unambiguous military equipment, for the most part, how to deal with physical equipment that might be on a ship, as opposed, or some other like, it doesn't really matter how it's shipped, but something where there's like a physical manifest of how it's crossing borders. How those rules that were written in the 80s, for the most part, apply to data is really complicated. And so for the most part, you're kind of making policy arguments as to how to interpret like these nuanced, ambiguous regulations. And like, if you don't understand the product, I don't know how you could possibly do that. So that was something I had to do pretty early on at Palantir. And I think it really paid dividends for me, because then even though Covariant's like a pretty different product, once you kind of can get over your initial fears of being technical, and like I had no technical background, like the reality is like if you understand how kind of regulations generally are structured, and I feel like that's what you bring in as a lawyer, like you can learn enough of the technical aspects of the product to be able to like make the regulatory determinations. It's not actually as scary as it may seem until you dig in.
Those are really great suggestions to be able to help take a regulation in one place, be able to apply that as new regulations keep coming, and they keep coming here in the States, globally, and being able to then apply it to the industry. And I would offer that how you apply that to a technical product would be really similar to how you might apply that to other industries. And sometimes professionals are moving from industry to industry, and I think that same approach could apply. Now, Craig, with all the knowledge you have about privacy and security and laws, what is your best privacy or security tip that you might offer while at a party?
At a party, well, I would say like, just on a personal level, like there's obvious things that I imagine any listener of this podcast already knows, like don't recycle your passwords, don't write them down on your iPhone. I mean, I do think one of the funny things you see are people who I think correctly their heads in the right place on privacy, and they'll talk to you at length about different ideas for where, like, for example, U.S. privacy policy should go and what like a national legislation maybe should look like. And then you'll see them sign into their email and they're opening up their phone to like see what the password is on their Apple Notes. Don't do things like that. Honestly, I feel like is low hanging fruit that people routinely do. The other thing I might say that's not really like a tip, but just kind of a comment is, I think that there's a lot of regulation being passed right now in Europe. Presumably in the US, there'll be some sort of AI legislation down the road. There's already been executive action. At the same time, there's been pretty increased enforcement of kind of FTC, antitrust enforcement that's kind of chilled the environment for tech mergers by smaller acquisitions of smaller tech companies. I'm no longer in a position where I could really comment on like what optimal antitrust policy should be, but I would just say that I do worry that like some of the more interesting, innovative AI kind of ideas that people are coming up with right now are in small companies, some of which actually like make incredible advances on privacy and security vis-a-vis what's out there right now on the open market. And one of the best ways for that to be proliferated, like to a much broader audience, is to be able to be acquired by like a Microsoft and then like kind of pushed out with their products and distribution networks. And so wherever the government comes out on privacy policy, I hope that they also are thinking through the antitrust component of it, because you wouldn't want to be in a position where we're holding back the ability to actually innovate on areas that would be privacy forward. That does come up at least at DC and parties, but
yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I would offer the antitrust issue as a big one in Europe as well.
So, Craig, when you're not learning all these different regulations and applying them for AI robotics, what do you like to do for fun?
Sure. So I grew up and I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, close to the DC border. I have 3 kids, Alani, Devin, and Perry, 8, 4, and 1, 3 girls. They definitely keep Melissa, my wife, and I busy. When we do have time, we like to play tennis, go skiing, and hiking, and otherwise just enjoy the cultural activities around the DC area.
Well, Craig, we're so excited that you came to share a really fascinating topic with us. If people would like to connect with you or learn more about Covariant, where should they go?
For sure. So if you just Google Craig Schwartz Covariant, you should be able to find my LinkedIn profile. You can also email me, cschwartz@covariant.ai.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so very much. Again, we really appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. This is fun.
Thanks for listening to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and check us out on LinkedIn. See you next time.